Hello and welcome to Sophy Ridge on Sunday. More than half of all adults in the UK have now received their first COVID-19 vaccine dose, a huge milestone in the fight against the virus. But the very success of the programme is bringing its own challenges. Conservative MPs now calling for freedoms to be restored as the government prepares to ask Parliament to renew its emergency coronavirus powers this week. And in Europe, grappling with its own vaccine rollout and a potential third wave of the virus, there's a threat to block AstraZeneca exports to countries with higher vaccination rates. Who could they be talking about? Lots to discuss on the show today. Well, on this week's Sophy Ridge on Sunday, we've got a lineup to cover all of that and more. We'll be speaking first to Steve Baker, the Deputy Chairman of the COVID Recovery Group of MPs, who wants to see restrictions eased. The Defence Secretary Ben Wallace will be joining us live too. And we'll be putting your questions about the vaccine, I'm sure you've got lots of them, to Professor Jeremy Brown, who sits on the UK's Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. Shadow Health Secretary Jonathan Ashworth will be speaking to us about Labour's call for a COVID recovery plan for the NHS. And away from the pandemic, one of Scotland's most senior judges, Lady Dorian, will be telling us about her proposals to change the way the justice system treats rape victims, including a possible end to jury trials. We'll also be asking the chair of Westminster's Select Committee on Women and Equalities, Caroline Noakes, if the police and courts are biased against women. And in what promises to be a huge week for Scottish politics, we'll be joined by the Scottish Health Secretary Jeane Freeman. First, though, we can talk to the Conservative MP, Steve Baker, the Deputy Chairman of the Self-Styled COVID Recovery Group. Thank you very much for being on the programme this morning, Mr.
Good morning.
Baker. So this week, Boris Johnson is expected to be pushing through this 6 months extension of the Coronavirus Act, which does things like give the police more powers. How are you going to be voting and why?
Well, I expect to vote against, but the thing is, with so many vulnerable people now vaccinated and record progress being made, people will be right to ask why the government is still seeking to hang on to these powers. To put it in context, under Schedule 21 of the Act, there's been a 100% record of unlawful prosecutions, 246 people unlawfully prosecuted. The Act makes provision to, for example, postpone elections, but we're not postponing elections this year. So the government does need to answer why, as so many people are vaccinated, they're not relaxing restrictions in line with that data. So this Easter, for example, it will be unlawful to stay away from home, and it will be unlawful to stay away from home with another household until the middle of May. So we need to be really careful here that the police don't end up in another invidious position where they're enforcing laws we've put in place to the surprise of politicians who then seem to feign shock that the public have been, for example, turned around on our motorways and sent home with a big fine.
You're talking there about the politicians feigning shock about the actions of the police. I mean, people would also be thinking about the Sarah Everard vigil. Do you think the police should be taking responsibility for, in some cases, perhaps being too heavy-handed, or do you put blame at the foot of politicians?
I think we politicians have got to take the blame here. The police obviously sometimes do make mistakes, and there have been instances which I wouldn't defend, like using drones to pursue people. But clearly it's difficult to see how it was a wise decision to break up the vigil. But that's not really the point. The point is the police are being put in an invidious position, as the Police Federation have said, as Dame Cressida Dick has said. We give them the law, we expect them to apply the law, we expect them to apply it equally to all, and we shouldn't be surprised when they do so. So, of course, there are occasions when the police, unfortunately, perhaps go too far, but you can't blame them when we've passed, powers have been used under 118 acts of Parliament to cope with coronavirus. So it's an extremely complex legal environment, something we've talked about before on your show, and the police have my sympathy. And it's we politicians, and the government in particular, of course, who control the business of the House of Commons, who need to justify every power they take and every power that they seek to hold on to, particularly whilst they're also quite rightly boasting of the great progress we're making on vaccinating people.
You say that you're expecting to vote against when this comes before the House of Commons next week. How big a rebellion do you think we could see?
It's very difficult to say until we've seen the exact detail of what the government's tabling and how the votes will come. But let's be absolutely clear, because it seems that Labour and the SNP will vote for any old authoritarianism these days, it looks like the government will, of course, get their business with an enormous majority. But I do think it's important that some of us do seek to hold the government to account with these extraordinary powers. It's obviously a very uncomfortable position for some of us to be in when it's our own party, and that's why we're trying to do it in a civilised way, asking reasonable questions. But the government will get its way, and at this stage, I wouldn't like to say how big any rebellion will be. Of course, the plan out of these restrictions is a path to freedom. It's just, unfortunately, we believe, many of us believe, that it squanders the advantages of our great vaccination programme. So it's difficult to see how very many people will want to vote against a path to freedom, but we'll need to look at exactly the detail. But the Coronavirus Act itself, I am expecting to vote squarely against. I think it's excessive and disproportionate, and the government itself now isn't using its powers. And where the police gain powers in the Act, as I've said, it's a 100% unlawful prosecution rate. So I think the Coronavirus Act should now go. That would not put the furlough scheme at risk. We've double-checked that and had it confirmed by the House of Commons Library. So obviously there's a lot to look at this week, but the government really does need to start taking advantage of their own great success on the vaccination programme.
At the same time, though, lots of people listening to you will be thinking the one lesson of the last year is that this virus is extremely unpredictable. Yes, the vaccination programme has been a success so far, but we're aware of supply issues bubbling up over the next month. It is unpredictable. They say that they want to lift restrictions by June and get us back to normal, but again, we don't know when things like new variants, for example, could rear their heads. Is it not sensible for the government in those circumstances to extend the Act?
Well, it's sensible for the government to take proportionate powers. Remember, the Civil Contingencies Act has far greater provision for scrutiny by Parliament when extraordinary powers are taken. And so one of the problems we've got here is in our panic and in our sort of blindness to all other factors, we've ended up with the government taking extraordinary powers with very limited parliamentary scrutiny, and we would not normally have approved such a thing. So really what I'm saying is to the government, they really should now start looking at dramatically reducing the range of powers that they have, making sure that the law is clear to the public and that the government has taken responsibility for that law so that the police aren't in an invidious position. But yes, of course, this is a tricky situation, but the chief medical officers have been very clear with us that the vaccines are expected to still protect people from hospitalisation and death, even with the variants. You know, that is a subject over which we've gone many times. We know that most of the protection comes from the first dose. The second dose is about longevity. That was a joint letter from the chief medical officers. So people on my side of the argument are trying very hard to carefully base our arguments on what we're being told by scientists.
There's a bit of a live debate among MPs and among everyone really about holidays, about whether summer holidays should be permitted to try and open up the travel industry, or if actually, because our vaccination programme may be speeding along while others is a bit more sluggish, it would be more sensible to press the pause button on overseas travel. What's your position?
I think with overseas travel, there's a very good case to look at it and say that actually, because of the situation in other countries, the government's got to take a very careful view. But what an extraordinary situation it is that you can't leave the country freely. I mean, these are powers, whatever the government's decision, whatever the advice is, these are powers which should be taken with great trepidation and regular parliamentary scrutiny. So I do think in relation to international travel, I do think it's inevitable with the situation where it is, with other countries' vaccination programmes being in such a different place. I do think it's inevitable that a different approach will be taken to the one domestically. But I think we've got to be sensible and proportionate on all sides of this argument. But yeah, I mean, I do expect that if our vaccination programme is proceeding at pace and people are safe because they're vaccinated, then they should be able to travel. But equally, I hope you won't mind, and I think your viewers would expect me to reserve my position a little to actually look at the data as it emerges.
Yeah, that's definitely fair enough. Steve Baker, thank you very much for being on the programme this morning. Always good to talk.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Steve Baker there making his position pretty clear ahead of those plans to extend the Coronavirus Act next week. So let's now find out what the position is from the government. We can go straight to speak to the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace to get his reaction to the interview with Steve Baker. Mr Baker says the plan to extend coronavirus powers for another 6 months is authoritarian, that there should be a path to freedom instead. Why do you want to extend it for that amount of time?
Look, we have, all of us, whether you're NHS workers or the members of the public, made incredible sacrifices over the last year to make sure that we try and get on top of this pandemic. You know, we are in a place at the moment where, unlike many other countries, we have started to get on top of it, slowed the flow into hospitals, started to reduce the tragic loss of life through it, and started to roll out the vaccine at an unprecedented level. I don't think now is the time to throw that away or potentially put that at risk. I think now is the time to the final mile is the most important thing for us all, to make sure that we buckle down, get through the different stages that the Prime Minister set out, the next one being the 29th of March and then another one on the 12th of April, and slowly but surely, all of us together make sure we tackle this dreadful pandemic.
I don't think anyone is saying that now is the time to lift restrictions or to stop the powers, but you're talking about extending this for another 6 months at a time when by mid-April the top 9 priority groups should have been vaccinated. They accounted for 99% of deaths in the first wave. Restrictions set to be lifted towards the end of June. Why do you need 6 more months?
Look, Parliament can put in place powers and it can always remove powers if it needs to. I think what we want to indicate and signal is, to the public at large, a plan that goes beyond a week by week and a sort of long-term plan, and therefore that involves putting certain tools in place. None of us want to have lots of draconian measures, but this is an unprecedented global pandemic that has cost tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives around the world. And therefore, putting those in place is really important. But of course, as the Prime Minister has been very, very clear, at each stage we will be taking assessments from the science, from where we are with this pandemic, and make the steps required. And, I'm not going to second guess what happens after June. I think that would be wrong. And, my constituents, people often forget this, my constituents in Preston have been locked down since the middle of August. They have sacrificed a huge amount to deal with this pandemic. And I really think the first and foremost thing to do is to roll out the vaccines, protect our NHS and make sure we take it step by step. And Steve Baker is a good friend of mine. He's a great MP. He's very diligent, and I fully respect his position. And it's right that the government is always asked about powers that it seeks to take. And we listen to his contribution, and I listened to it just now. But, for us as a government, I have to hold the balance between the needs of my constituents to be protected, the needs of the NHS, and indeed the needs to get on top of this virus so we can get the economy back up and running.
Just to be clear, you're saying that politicians can impose powers but also remove powers. You're saying that these powers may not last the full 6 months. You could take them away earlier.
Well, I think that's just going into the realms of speculation. I think my point is...
Well, you said that you were the one who raised the idea of removing powers.
No, Sophie, you're saying that, as if it's a one-way street. I think you were trying to imply that just because we're going to put powers in place and somehow that means it'll definitely be there for a very long time. I think the point is we're going to put the powers in place to deal with the pandemic and the measures that we think need to be implemented and complied with.
And of course, at each stage
we take those views. But they could be put in, they could be extended, Sophie. All these things are what Parliament can do. Parliament is there to obviously scrutinise the government proposals. I think my point is it is not a one-way street. Just because we're seeking to have the powers, it doesn't mean to say we're deaf to how facts change on the ground. And all the way through this, following the science, following the facts, looking at outbreaks around the world, has informed us. It'll inform us with the task force around international travel that's going to report to the Prime Minister in April. It'll inform us around the passporting task force. It'll also inform the Prime Minister in April. And we will take it step by step. But for my constituents who have been locked down since August, having a sense of plan, having a sense of stability is probably the most important thing, so that they can get on with their lives, get their children back to school, but also understand what the government's next steps are.
You mentioned how the plans will inform things like foreign travel. What is the position on foreign travel? Is it likely that we'll be able to go on holiday this summer? And what are your own holiday plans?
Well, my colleague, the Transport Secretary, said only recently that it's highly unlikely we'll be able to go on foreign holidays as such, this side of May or indeed in early May. But we're going to wait for these task force to report to the Prime Minister in April. They're going to take a look at it. We can't be deaf and blind to what's going on outside the United Kingdom. If you look in Europe, the increases of infections, and we can't put at risk the huge amount of effort by the taxpayer, by the NHS, by our scientists in developing this vaccine. And if we were to be reckless in any way and import new variants that put at risk, then what would people say about that? We've got a good direction of travel. We're getting there, and I think we need to make sure we preserve that at all costs.
You mentioned there the rising cases in Europe. There's also been a lot of criticism of the vaccine rollout across the EU as well. And Ursula von der Leyen, with the backing of France and Germany, has again threatened to potentially block exports of AstraZeneca to countries such as the UK, who've got a higher vaccination rate than many in Europe. Now, the Foreign Secretary has accused the EU of acting like less democratic countries. Do you think that the EU is acting like a dictatorship?
Well, look, I will take the President of the European Commission's words that she gave to the Prime Minister a few months ago, that the European Commission and Britain were not going to engage in breaking contracts. All of us recognise the importance of international law and upholding contract law around the world. I mean, the European Union will know that the rest of the world is looking at the Commission about how it conducts itself on this. And if contracts get broken and undertakings, that is a very damaging thing to happen for a trading bloc that prides itself on the rule of law, prides itself on following, contracts and being an open trading bloc. And I think, the Commission knows deep down the world is watching what happens. And also it would be counterproductive, because the one thing we know about vaccine production and manufacturers is it is collaborative. The Oxford University and AstraZeneca developed this, the intellectual property that led to the vaccine. How the vaccine is manufactured involves countries not just in Europe, not just in the United Kingdom, but even further afield in such places as India. And if we start to unpick that, and if the Commission were to start to do that, I think they would undermine not only their own citizens' chances of having a proper vaccine programme, but also many other countries around the world with a reputational damage for the EU that I think they would find very hard to change over the short term.
It's interesting that you talk about the interdependency of vaccine manufacturing. That's something that Pfizer has reportedly also flagged to Brussels and the EU, saying that actually parts of the ingredients that they need are made in the UK. If the EU did decide to block exports, do you think you could see some kind of retaliation from countries like the UK?
Look, so first of all, the United Kingdom already has its own manufacturing capability in some areas, and because of the decisions the government took, and Matt Hancock and the Prime Minister earlier on, we have invested in a range of types of vaccines that will give us more opportunities. We'll continue to explore growing those supplies if needs be, but I think let's remember we have now vaccinated over half the adult population, unprecedented levels for a country of our size, well above most countries or all countries in Europe, and we're on the right direction. We're going to continue to vaccinate. I myself got my first text the other day calling me to have my vaccination, and day by day the vaccines minister and Matt Hancock will explore all supply routes, and I think the Commission knows deep down, the governments of the European Union know deep down that this would be counterproductive to start effectively down this route of if it is true what she's been saying, and I think it's really important that we just Look, Sophie, I think they're under tremendous political pressure on the European Commission. I think it's really a matter for them of how they deal with it. But, the values that they espouse of the European Union of upholding the rule of law, being a trading bloc, all of that means that you follow those contracts, that you honour them, that you agreed. And I think, it would damage the EU's reputation globally should they renege on those things.
OK, now, congratulations, by the way, on getting your own vaccination text. We know, of course, we've had an absolutely stonking couple of days for the vaccine rollout, but things could get a bit more bumpy over the next month, partly because of this delay from India. Can you just explain what is the reason for that delay? The Prime Minister said that India hasn't blocked anything. We've been told technical reasons, but frankly, I mean, that is quite meaningless, the idea of it's just technical reasons. Why has that been delayed? And as a result of these issues in the supply chain, are we now looking at trying to manufacture more doses here in the UK?
Well, first of all, as I said earlier, Sophie, we already have a manufacturing capability in the United Kingdom. We're always exploring where we can increase that manufacturing capability, whether that's home or with other international partners, and we'll continue to do so. I'm afraid I don't know the exact details of what's going on in Indian factories and development, but you know what we have seen, and we saw it with I think AstraZeneca and Pfizer, is that these technical issues are real. They do happen. You know, when you suddenly massively expand a vaccination program, what you get at the end of that is, you know, sometimes, you know, that takes time. You would have reported a few weeks ago the slowdown in supply, which I think upset the European Commission at that stage, when some of the factories in Europe had to reset and enlarge. I think that's perfectly to be expected. That's why the Prime Minister appointed Nadeem Zahawi as a vaccine minister, to make sure we did everything we can globally to iron out supply chains.
Talking as well, just finally, on the vaccine, we've seen a difficult week for AstraZeneca. European countries pausing the rollout, many of them restarting it. And of course, this comes off the back of, for example, the French president describing it as quasi-effective. Do you think some of this criticism of the AstraZeneca vaccine is political rather than being based on science?
Well, I think what it shows, and you know, as Defence Secretary, sort of here to hopefully launch our defence reforms, what it shows is that in the world we live in, and the global world we live in, information is a very, very important tool, and we have to make sure that as politicians and as governments of country, we are responsible with how we use that information, and that we are...
Has the French president been responsible?
Well, I'll let the media be a judge of that. My view is that the European Medicals Agency has approved AstraZeneca to be safe. A number of countries that said they were going to pause it have now done a U-turn and are starting to roll it out. And I think it's really for the governments of each of those European countries to answer the questions of their own citizens about why or when they're going to get their vaccines.
OK. Now, as you say, you are Defence Secretary. You're publishing the Defence Command paper tomorrow. Now, there are reports that the army is going to be cut by 10,000 troops as part of that. Is that true?
Well, look, I'm not going to reveal on the media before Parliament, I'm afraid, the details of numbers of our men and women of our armed forces. You know, it's important that I deliver the command paper. Parliament establishes the armed forces. That is my obligation to Parliament. So I'm not going to get into the speculation. We had in November a speculative story, I remember, in the BBC about cutting the army to 65,000. I've seen lots of numbers used. I think the assurance I can give the viewers is that, you know, what I will be doing is making sure we have an armed forces that's the right size to meet the threat and the right size to meet the government's ambition of having a global Britain that can uphold values and support its allies.
And you're launching this new spy ship. What's the idea?
Well, I think back in November, the Prime Minister announced a multi-role surveillance vessel. I don't call it a spy ship. I mean, obviously, what's key here is to make sure that we protect our critical national infrastructure. What we have seen is that our adversaries have spotted that some of our weaknesses are obviously different from what they were 10, 20 years ago. We are very, very dependent on things like cables and satellites in space. And if we don't invest in the capabilities to protect those, then we will be left deeply vulnerable. And there's lots of media reporting around some Russian programs that we have seen about looking at that. And therefore, it's my duty as Defence Secretary to make sure we invest in capabilities to make sure the lights don't go out at home.
You're talking a lot, of course, about a sort of changing world and the sort of new threats. One of the biggest challenges, of course, is how to deal with China. Now, this week, your Integrated Defence Review called for a positive trade and investment relationship with China. In light of China's actions in Hong Kong towards the Uyghur Muslims, shouldn't we be a bit tougher than that?
Well, I think we are certainly tougher than previous governments. We are putting in place new legislation to make sure...
Well, that's not hard when you look at David Cameron and George Osborne.
Sophie, look, what I would say is we are putting in place laws to make sure that we, the government, can protect our security and our businesses from being bought up potentially by Chinese companies that would seek to take away that intellectual property. The Foreign Secretary only a few weeks ago set out a range of measures to look at companies that may trade in the region of China where the Uyghur are being systematically and clearly persecuted. And we have over time called out members of the Chinese government who've been involved in cybercrime and cyber espionage. And not only that, we've also raised it in the UN and asked for investigations and further work on calling out this behaviour.
So, calling out, though, sorry just to come in, because some people listening to you will say, calling out, that's just not enough, is it? Just calling somebody out. China's not going to care about that. You want to have a positive trade and investment relationship. This is a country that's holding Uyghurs in camps. There are reports of women being forcibly sterilised, children being taken away and left in orphanages. Is the position effectively that if you're wealthy enough, a country, if you're an important enough trading partner, then we won't do anything else other than just say a few words that calling you out?
No, Sophie. Look, first of all, we live in the world we live in, not in the world we necessarily are at or wish to be. And on that route, to get there, what we need to make sure is that we use all the tools we have at our disposal. But, British companies up and down this country trade with China. Their customers go into shops and buy things from products that are manufactured in China. And yes, we want to do more to encourage British manufacturing and more to diversify that supply chain, because that is ultimately the best way to get stronger leverage on China, to get their behaviour to change, which is to be, A, less dependent on them, but also use those levers. And I think my point of view would be, if we didn't trade with China, we would actually have, in some areas, less levers to try and influence China's behaviour. The international community, alongside the United States and others, and in the UN, know that we want China's behaviour to change. We think it is appalling what's going on with the Uyghur. But, we cannot just overnight stop trading directly with China. What we can do is take steps to make sure that the trade we do is restricted, that the trade, we have an arms embargo on China, for example, and that we take steps. We are wide-eyed about China's place in the world, but China's place in the world is significantly large. And again, as I said, over the years, people have had a different relationship with China. We are effectively resetting that, making it very clear the parameters and taking steps where we can.
OK, Ethiopia, a huge issue at the moment, a really devastating situation. 4 months of war, 500,000 people lost their homes. What is the UK doing?
Well, first of all, at the United Nations, we've called that out, led calling out of that. We've also, the ambassador asked and called upon the forces there to de-escalate, and we are horrified by what we've seen. I think we're going to investigate that further. The ambassador on the ground has been very clear. We call upon all the parties to step away, and it's just horrendous what's been going on, and that's why at the UN, and obviously we are chairing the Security Council at the moment in the United Nations, making sure that the United Nations and the international community come along to make sure that this just doesn't get any worse, and in fact we deal with those people that have done those things.
And one more very quick question while I have you. Reports today that refugees are going to be granted indefinite leave to remain in the UK to try and encourage more legal routes. What's the idea?
Well, the Home Secretary will obviously announce the details next week when the bill is launched at Parliament. And I don't think I would speculate on some of the press reports about legislation before it is put forward, or indeed white papers to government. But I think first and foremost we recognise that the asylum seeker is not working well. We have to deal with that. We have to also deal with the people traffickers that bring people across the channel. They are wicked people doing some horrendous things, and it is not in a place we want it to be, and so we've got to work with it. We also recognise, however, that conflict drives a lot of this migration, which is why as Defence Secretary I have to make it very clear to people that Defence is not only in the business, if it has to, of hard power such as fighting a war if that's what is required to defend this nation, but also in the business of conflict prevention. And you talk about the issues around, for example, Ethiopia. We're in Sudan, we're in Somalia over the years as the British Armed Forces, because security is often, first and foremost, what is most important to preventing those refugee flows in the first place.
OK, thank you so much for being on the programme today. Ben Wallace there, thank you.
Thank you.
That was the Defence Secretary. Now, as we were just discussing, it's been a big week for vaccinations in every sense. On Friday, a record number, more than 700,000 people got the jab. But issues with supply means the UK won't keep up that pace. And despite all the evidence, Europe's stop-start attitude towards AstraZeneca may have raised concerns in some people's minds about safety. Now, we've been asking you to send in your questions. We've got just the man to answer them. Professor Jeremy Brown sits on the UK's Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. Thank you very much for being with us today. Before we get to the viewers' questions, I've just got a couple from myself, if you wouldn't mind. Half of UK adults have now received their first dose of a vaccine, a huge milestone, of course. But there are issues with supply over the next month. How concerned should we be about those issues? And do you think they will definitely be resolved after 4 weeks?
The truthful answer, so good morning, Sophie, is I don't really know, because the supply side of things is not really what the JCVI is involved with. I mean, it does look like we have been making a vaccine program which is doing almost 5 million a week, which would have been a fantastic result if we could maintain that. But it's always been supply of vaccine that has been the concern that might delay things. And yes, I suspect our vaccine program will be delayed slightly compared to where we thought it might have been a few weeks ago. But then at that point, we're actually ahead of schedule. So we're probably going to fall back to the original schedule and end up with everyone who's an adult being offered the vaccine by towards the middle to end of the summer, I suspect.
OK. Yeah, not too long to wait then for all adults, certainly. Now, as you say, we've been making some great progress. We're going to have vaccinated all of the top 9 priority groups by mid-April. They account for 99% of deaths in the first wave. At the beginning of the programme, we heard from Steve Baker, who was saying that because of the success of the vaccination programme, we should now look at lifting some of the restrictions. What's your take on that?
OK, this is a slightly complicated and tricky thing to describe, but at the moment, we have roughly sort of 95% of people who are at high risk being vaccinated. But that 5 or 10% of people is still a significant number. And also, we've mainly done 1 dose of vaccine, which gives most of the protection, but not all of the protection. Until we've done the 2nd dose in everybody who's been vaccinated, there is a little degree of infection that can still occur. So if you completely lift all restrictions, there will be a wave of infections crossing the country, and those that are not protected, either because the first vaccine hasn't worked very well in them and they need their 2nd dose, or because they have not had a vaccine at this point in time but are still vulnerable, they will get infections and they will probably end up in hospital and die. So if you lift restrictions, even though most people are at risk of being vaccinated, the proportion that have not still represents a very large number of people who could end up with serious infection. That's
a very clear explanation, thank you. There has, of course, been some people who are slightly hesitant about getting a vaccine, a bit worried, and of course what we've seen in Europe with the AstraZeneca vaccine may not have helped things. Just take France as an example. First, they only allowed that jab for the under 65s, then it was suspended, then the suspension was lifted. Now it's only allowed for over 55s. The President described it as quasi-effective, of course, and then the Prime Minister took it. Do you think some of this is more about politics than science? OK, so that's I can't answer for the politicians and why they're making certain statements, but I don't think the vaccine committees in the different countries are making their decisions because of politics. But I do think they've been misguided in the way they've approached this, where they felt that the precautionary principle was that because of the issue raised about blood clots, they should stop the vaccination program, the AstraZeneca, until they looked into it. Whereas, in fact, actually, if you looked at the data, it was unlikely to be a serious issue in the first place. And the benefit of the vaccine far outweighs any potential risk due to blood clots, etc. So, I mean, the numbers are like 100 to 1,000-fold more likely that you would die of COVID and that the vaccine would prevent that than anything could possibly happen to the blood clots. So I think stopping and starting the program was a strategic error by the other countries. And could it have led to more deaths?
Well, yes, literally. I mean, I think it's a bit complicated because, again, you stop the vaccine program for a few days, what that means is that the vaccine program is pushed back by a few days, and perhaps maybe in the scheme of things, that's not a great loss. But actually, at this point in time, they are having a third wave of infection. So actually, it does represent a delay in the vaccine program just when they need it the most. So I do think that was not well thought out.
OK, let's bring in some questions from viewers. We've had a great response, actually. And this one from Jeanette on Instagram. She asks, I got the Pfizer jab first time. Will I definitely get it for my second jab? Because I'm reading there may be a shortage of Pfizer in the next few months. Yeah,
well, as far as I understand, again, I'm not an expert on supply, but everyone who's had the Pfizer the first time will get the Pfizer the second time, and AstraZeneca ditto the same. They get AstraZeneca the second time, and the supply has been matched to allow that to happen. So that should happen.
Reassuring news there for Jeanette. This is a question we got through Twitter. Once we've vaccinated the top 9 cohorts in the UK and we have enough supply for second doses, doesn't it make sense to assist the rest of Europe where deaths and hospitalisations are rising?
Yeah, this one, I struggle with this a little bit, I have to say. I mean, there's a certain amount of, I like to get the whole country sorted as quickly as possible. But the issue about vaccinating the rest of the world, there's an ethical and also a self-interest in doing so. I suppose the question is, what can we do to help the Europeans with their vaccine programme? And I don't actually think that the UK can help that much, because supply isn't necessarily the problem anymore in Europe. And it's the sort of the rollout and how you deliver it, how you convince the local population to take it, which is the problems. And those really are local questions for the European countries themselves. I think it's a different question for the developing world, where delivering the vaccines in the developing world is going to be an immense task and very complex. And I do believe the UK should contribute to that in a big way as much as it can.
OK, this is a question from Jo Edwards. We've got a lot of similar questions to this, actually. She asks, what is the plan for immunosuppressed people? I've had both doses of the vaccine, but I haven't developed any antibodies. What's the plan?
OK, so this is quite close to my heart, because my clinical practice is I look after people who've got lung problems with leukemia or bone marrow transplants, and the infection in that population is a big issue due to their weak immune systems. So the first thing I can say, I can be a little bit reassuring, is that the question I've seen in the email is that actually she's not developed antibodies to the vaccine. The question that actually may not reflect that she has no immune system response to the vaccine, because there are multiple levels to the immune response to the vaccine. The antibody that the NHS measures is the N antigen, and you would not get an antibody response to that if you've been vaccinated, because the vaccine doesn't contain the N antigen, it contains the spike, the S antigen. So that's...
I'm sorry, great answer to that question. Definitely will be a bit of reassurance there, I think, for Jo. Simon Usher posted this question on Instagram. How long will the COVID vaccine last before having to receive additional doses in the future?
Yeah, the simple answer to that is I don't know, and nobody knows, because we've not had long enough to see. I mean, what we need to know is what the antibody response looks like 12 months after vaccination. And as the clinical trials were published in November, December last year, we're going to have to wait until autumn before we can actually answer that question with any degree of confidence.
And just a final question here. This is from Twitter. This is from Kieran. He asks, what's the point of vaccines? If once everyone eligible has had the jab, we're still expected to follow mask and social distancing rules. I don't expect this to be asked because it rocks the boat, which of course makes me really want to ask this question. So what is the point of vaccines?
Yeah, no, I think I answered that question a little bit earlier. I mean, I think essentially until we can suppress infection going around the country, which means vaccinating everybody, then some degree of social distancing or protection is going to be required, just because even a small proportion of people who have not been vaccinated or where the vaccine has not worked very well would be at a high risk of disease if we have no control of infection. And the control of the infection comes in once a very high proportion of the country have been vaccinated. We now know that the vaccine does prevent transmission to a degree, but that only works on a population level once you've vaccinated a high proportion of the population. So that's phase 2 of the vaccine programme.
Some really fascinating answers there. I'm sure that the viewers will be really happy with those responses. Just one final one from me, if I may, before we let you go. Just to clarify, are you expecting every adult in the UK to have received first dose by the end of July, or do you think that could now slip into August?
I don't know. I mean, I think July, August, those are the ballpark areas where we would hope that every adult has been offered their first dose of the vaccine.
OK, that is very helpful. Thank you so much for being on the programme. Thank you for asking our questions as well. Much appreciated.
Right, bye-bye.
Now, the pandemic has, of course, put a huge strain on the NHS and resources prioritised to tackle people dying from COVID. But that, of course, means that waiting lists for other kinds of treatment have grown, from cancer care to mental health. So let's talk about this with the Shadow Health Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth, who joins us from Leicester. By prioritising COVID, have we taken our eye off the ball when it comes to other important health conditions?
Well, it's understandable as to why we had to prioritise COVID, because, to be frank, if you underfund your NHS over many years, if you cut beds, if you try and run your NHS with vacancies for 100,000 staff, and you cut training, you cut public health, you cut social care, that means when a crisis like this hits, you're more exposed and vulnerable. But we shouldn't have to make a choice between COVID care and cancer care. But that's what we've been doing. And today we're missing all the targets, all the main targets for cancer care. We've got a huge backlog in our waiting list, over 300,000 people now waiting beyond 12 months for treatment. It was 1,600 a year ago. This is risking loss of livelihoods and permanent disability. For some, it's risking loss of life. So we're saying to the government, we need an NHS rescue package. We need a plan to put the funding into the NHS. But crucially, we need a plan now to recruit the staff that we're going to need for the future to deliver the quality care that patients deserve.
Now, we've been talking a lot about COVID and, of course, the Coronavirus Act later on this week that everyone's going to be voting on. Steve Baker earlier on the programme said that Labour would vote for any old authoritarian measures, so he expects you to vote in favour of extending the Act for another 6 months. Is he right?
Well, I don't agree with the way he's characterised it. And, of course, he voted, and lots of Conservative MPs voted for lots of authoritarian measures last week in the House of Commons. Look, whether we like it or not, the virus is still circulating. We've got around 6,000 infections a day. That is a high level of virus circulating. It's much less than where we have been, obviously, but it's still quite dangerous out there. So yes, vaccination is rolling ahead and is succeeding, but we still have to be cautious. We still have to proceed carefully. We have to be driven by the data. And that will mean, I'm afraid, that governments will have to have the powers to impose restrictions where necessary. So there are bits of that Act which need to be properly scrutinised and haven't actually been implemented. And I'm going to be asking Matt Hancock why certain elements of that Act around social care, continuing health care, need to remain on the statute book. But there's other elements in that Act which I believe are needed. Governments do need to be able to impose restrictions. Governments do need to pay statutory sick pay from day one. I'd actually like them to go further and pay more sick pay. And governments do need to stop people being evicted from their homes if they can't pay the rent because of their livelihoods have been so hit by this pandemic. So it's a complex piece of legislation.
You'll be voting in favour, though?
It's a complex piece of legislation. We broadly support it. It ought to be properly scrutinised. I mean, I think what is frustrating is that Steve Baker, who I have tremendous respect for, should be given the opportunity to put forward amendments to the Act. But the way in which the government timetable these deliberations means he's denied that opportunity. This Act was emergency legislation a year ago. It should be properly scrutinised now. And if Steve Baker and Graham Brady wants to work with us to get the House of Commons to agree a proper process to thoroughly scrutinise that Act so we can all put forward amendments, I'd be happy to sit down with him tomorrow to see if we can find that procedure.
You're clearly concerned about the way ahead. You say that we shouldn't take our foot off the pedal, if you like. And there are rising cases in Europe as well. What is your position on summer holidays? Are they something that needs to be sacrificed in order to keep cases low here?
Well, I've always said we have to proceed with caution. We have to study the data at every stage. Because sadly, and I don't want to disappoint the viewers, but just vaccination in the whole of the United Kingdom, while important and will save lives, does not make us bulletproof. It does not make us completely safe. We are only safe when everybody is safe. So long as the virus appears to be surging in France, in Germany and parts of Europe, which it is at the moment because this is their B117 wave. That's the Kent variant. That we've had our Kent variant wave, if you like. Their Kent variant wave is now surging. So we are not safe while the virus circulates in these huge numbers across the world. And of course, we run the risk that more variants, more mutations emerge, which bounce back and hit us and potentially evade the vaccine success that we have had. So it's a long way to answer your question, is that it's too early to make a judgment around the May 17th date on international travel, I would argue. I'm not expecting myself to go on a holiday abroad this summer, but we'll obviously keep these things under review. And we have to continue to do all we can to squash the infections down and protect the success of vaccination here in the United Kingdom.
Well, after speaking to you and Ben Wallace this morning, it does feel like maybe holding back on booking that foreign holiday might be a good move. Just finally, while I have you, Labour have selected the former MP Paul Williams to fight the Hartlepool by-election. He was on an all-male, all-white shortlist of one. In the Labour Party, is everyone a feminist until it doesn't suit you anymore?
Say that again. Sorry, I should say that again, sorry.
In the Labour Party, is everyone a feminist as long as it suits you and then stops?
Well, we're still committed to all-women shortlists and improving the representation of women in Parliament. We've actually got more than 50%, I think, of women in the Parliamentary Labour Party because of all-women shortlists, and we're very proud of that, and we will continue to use all-women shortlists in parliamentary selections and future by-election selections.
Just not this one?
Well, I wasn't involved in this. I mean, I'm not on the Labour NEC who takes these decisions. I'm pretty busy dealing with our COVID response, to be honest. But we will use all women shortlists in other parliamentary selections. I've got absolutely no doubt of that.
OK, Jonathan Ashworth, thank you very much for being on the programme this morning. Thank you. Now, away from the pandemic, a review group led by one of Scotland's most senior judges has recommended that a new specialist court should be created to deal with serious sexual offences. Now, the recommendations from Lord Justice Clerk Lady Dorian are aimed at making the experience for victims less traumatic. Now, the report recommends the use of pre-recorded evidence so that victims don't need to keep repeating traumatic stories. A new specialist court will be set up so judges, prosecutors and defenders would get training to deal with vulnerable witnesses. And the most dramatic suggestion was a pilot where cases would be heard only by a judge with no jury. Now, I asked Lady Dorian to explain more about her report and the reasoning behind it.
The main recommendation is for a specialist court to deal with all serious cases of sexual assault or any other sexual offences, and that court should be staffed by individuals who have had particular training, trauma-informed training, from the judges all the way down through all the participants, and that there should be, in addition to that, as a default feature of the court, that the evidence of complainers in sexual cases should be captured on video in advance of the trial, well in advance of the trial.
One of the most eye-catching, some would say controversial, things that you put forward as a suggestion is that some trials could be done not by juries but by judges. What is the thinking behind that? Do you basically not trust juries to always give the right verdict in some of these very sensitive cases?
The reasoning behind that was that we are dealing with, in this review, we're dealing with the problem about how these cases are managed that has been with us for many, many years. And we keep having similar discussions about them. And in the course of our discussions, we looked at other options for dealing with these cases other than juries, and considered that this was a subject that needed to be examined further. So we're not recommending that juries should be abolished for these cases. We're simply saying that's a conversation that needs to take place and needs to be informed by public discussion.
And is that because you are worried that rape myths or preconceptions, I guess, are quite widespread among society?
It's because we feel that the idea that we simply carry on doing things the way that we have always been doing them isn't necessarily the best way forward. And if we're exploring the idea of a completely new court, we should be open to looking at all other options that could be available.
Well, it's interesting to hear one of the judges who's been quoted to say that in some of these sensitive cases where there's evidence of a quality and quantity which for any other kind of crime would lead to a conviction, I see a number of acquittals each year in rape cases, which to my mind are not explicable by rational application of the law to the evidence. Is that something that you agree with?
That's one of the discussion points that featured in the course of the debate about the various options that were available, and was a view put forward in the course of debate which informed our eventual conclusion.
Do you think the current setup is perhaps biased against women in any way?
What we felt was that the current system required to be improved so that the complainers, men and women, found that the experience was less traumatic.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about the idea of it being traumatic, the idea of going through the whole process of reporting, a violent crime or a rape against yourself. One of the former chief constables of Nottinghamshire Police told Women's Hour this week that she would hesitate before bringing anything forward. She would struggle, she said, to report a crime against herself because of what she described as the endless repeated humiliation. I mean, do you feel that too?
Well, one of the factors that we felt was necessary for us to look at was whether there were aspects of the way things are dealt with at the moment which did not assist complainers to move on from having the experience that they'd had and which were capable of re-traumatization. One of the most common issues that arose in that discussion was that people felt having to give their account repeatedly was something which was capable of re-traumatizing them. And so we looked at whether we could start from a position that a court would adopt trauma-centered, trauma-based approaches which would avoid that.
And we've seen such an outpouring of, grief and anger after the Sarah Everard's death in the UK. Do you feel that now is the time to really start seriously looking in Scotland, but also in other parts of the UK as well, about how we deal with these crimes against women and girls?
Well, obviously, cases of murder would not be part of the remit of our review. We were dealing only with sexual offences. But one of the things that drove the review was the feeling that it was necessary to look at how these cases as a whole were managed and that we could do better.
And if you look at the conviction rates for rape and also sexual offences, they've always been pretty low, and it feels like they're getting worse. I mean, certainly in England and Wales, over the last 3 years, rape convictions more than halved. Do you think things are getting worse?
Well, we didn't proceed on the basis that the conviction rate was a driving factor in our report. We proceeded on the basis that what was necessary was to find a better way of managing the cases that avoided traumatization. We very specifically decided that we should not approach matters on the basis that there was any kind of appropriate conviction rate or that convictions should be a marker of success. So we adopted a completely different approach, which was simply to look at the experience of those who were complaining of sexual violence, women or men.
Has it been quite hard in your career to have seen the impact on some of these people who do come forward?
Yes, some of the accounts that we had that explained that people felt re-traumatized after their engagement with the criminal justice system was one that was difficult for us to hear, because clearly that is not the intention. And we had to listen to that and find a way of creating a system that would not do that.
Do you feel that rape has been effectively decriminalised in the UK because of the low conviction rates?
I don't think that's something that was within the review group's remit or that I can comment on. It's a crime that's taken very seriously, and it continues to be taken very seriously. And this review shows how seriously we intend to take it.
OK, thank you so much. And thank you so much for coming on and explaining some of the details about the review as well. Lady Dorian there. Well, let's get some reaction to that interview and the review. We're joined now by Caroline Noakes, the chair of the Women and Equalities Committee at Westminster. Thank you for being with us. We just heard there some of the details of Lady Dorian's review into making the whole justice system easier for victims of rape and serious sexual offences. Would you like to see some of these changes apply throughout the UK?
Well, I think it's important to reflect that Scotland has a separate justice system, but it's absolutely crucial that we find effective ways to support victims through the criminal justice system, whether they be male or female. And there have been good initiatives put in place. The independent sexual violence advisors who are supporting complainants through the whole process and being with them in court. But I think there are some really significant problems about encouraging victims to come forward, making sure that police make referrals to the CPS, making sure that the CPS has the confidence to take things to trial, that we see not just more convictions, but more prosecutions. You won't get the convictions without the prosecutions in the first place. And I really think it's time that the government look closely at having a women's justice strategy so that we can see victims supported from the start to the end of the process.
As you say, there are some clear issues with the process, not enough women coming forward, not enough referrals to the CPS. And then if you look at the last 3 years, rape convictions more than halving in England and Wales. I mean, one of the most controversial suggestions from Lady Dorian is the fact that actually some of these trials should be heard not by juries who may be vulnerable to rape myths, for example, but by trained judges. I mean, is that the kind of road that we need to go down if we're going to get serious about getting convictions?
Well, look, we have a long history and principle of crimes being tried by a jury of your peers in this country. And I think that that is important. But I also think it's right that we have a full and frank conversation about how we can do things better, how perhaps we can do things quicker. I thought one of the most important points that Lady Dorian made was about victims having to relive their trauma, potentially many times and over a long period. And I think that we need to find a way that the whole process can be speeded up so that victims see cases coming to court much more quickly and then have the opportunity to move on with the rest of their lives.
It does feel, doesn't it, that one of the positive things after a really gruelling couple of weeks for so many women has been that we are starting to have a more full and frank conversation about the kind of harassment, the kind of assault as well that some people face and so many women do see as a fabric of their lives. You recently gave an interview where you said a Labour MP tried to grope you. I mean, talk about your own experience if you want to. Obviously, don't feel that you have to. But how much of an issue do you think this is for all women, the kind of things that we've been hearing?
It's too common in every walk of life, in every, and this will be shocking for people to hear, in every school playground, in every university, in every workplace. This is going on far too often. And when you read the statistics about the number of young women that have been subject to sexual assault or harassment, they're horrific. And that's why I'm very happy to co-sign amendments with people like Harriet Harman to make sexual harassment in a public place outlawed. I think that that's really important. We have to change the culture. And that's why my committee has, in this last week, launched an inquiry into the cultures that are underpinning male violence against women. I think it's crucial that we don't just pontificate on this. We need some practical solutions and we need them quickly, whether that be through the court system, whether that's through education, whether we have a candid conversation about pornography, the ease of access to it for young people, and what that's doing to give them a completely skewed impression of what adult sexual relationships are like.
Talking about changing the culture, the Sunday Mirror has a story this morning about the culture within the police. Former police officers criticising sexism and misogyny. Sir Peter Fahey, who's the former Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police, said that if a member of his family was attacked, he would probably advise them not to report it. He also said there's no way his daughter would join the police force. Is there a problem of sexism in the police?
Well, I think that's a matter for the police themselves to investigate and look at. But reports like that, advising your children not to join the police, not wanting to report crimes. I think we have a really important job to do here, empowering women who are victims of crime to go to the police, to know that they will be believed, that they will have their cases listened to sympathetically. I know here in Hampshire Police, there are more than 100 officers working on this sort of crime, and it's treated with great sensitivity and care. But that's led by a female chief constable who is absolutely committed to doing that. I think it's absolutely vital that we have to find better ways to give women confidence. And when you look at the statistics around sexual violence, the statistics around sexual harassment, unfortunately, we're letting far too many women down.
OK, thank you so much for covering the programme this morning. Caroline Noakes there, thank you. Now, it's going to be a big week in Scotland, which could determine the fate of the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. There are not one but two reports due into the way in which the Scottish Government mishandled complaints of sexual misconduct against Alex Salmond, and whether Nicola Sturgeon personally broke the ministerial code by misleading the Scottish Parliament about what she knew and when. Well, we're joined now by the Scottish Health Secretary Jeane Freeman. If Nicola Sturgeon is found to have broken the ministerial code, should she resign?
Well, we don't have either of those two confirmed reports yet, so we're getting a bit of ahead of ourselves. The most important one is actually the independent inquiry into whether the First Minister breached the ministerial code that she referred herself to in January 2019. We expect that report this week, and that is the one where James Hamilton, the QC, has looked at all of these matters, and he will produce his conclusions. That's the one that is genuinely independent and objective, and we will see what that report says, and then the First Minister will take the necessary decisions after that.
A poll for Sky News found that 51% of people thought that Nicola Sturgeon should resign if she broke the ministerial code. Just 35% said she should stay in her job. And she, of course, has spoken about the importance of it too. When she launched the ministerial code in 2018, she said, "I'll lead by example in following the letter and spirit of the code." Surely, if she is found to have broken the code, she needs to go, doesn't she?
Well, the First Minister has led by example throughout, and I think the public, particularly the public in Scotland, have seen how open and frank her leadership is, particularly over the last year when we've been dealing with the pandemic. The committee report is not yet concluded. What we have is unattributable briefings and leaks from that committee, which is actually, as it happens, against the MSP Code of Conduct. So the situation here is important, it's serious. What's most serious, actually, is that the Scottish Government made serious mistakes in handling and implementing the policy on harassment. And the people who have suffered most in that are the women who brought those complaints. That's what the committee was supposed to be looking at. But even before the First Minister appeared in front of that committee and for 8 hours answered their questions, even before that, the Scottish Conservatives were calling for her resignation. So I think we can dismiss some of that, at least, as a bit of partisan politics, 40-odd days out from a Scottish election, and focus our attention on what the genuinely independent report from Mr Hamilton QC says when we receive that, I hope, this week.
Not long to wait for that. I'm keen to talk to you about COVID as well, because, of course, we've had these issues of vaccine supplies, a delayed shipment from India. Nicola Sturgeon saying this week Scotland is going to have 500,000 fewer doses over the next month than anticipated. What does that mean for the vaccine rollout in Scotland?
What it means is that there is a lot of... We model every single day the anticipated supply against the scheduled appointments. We think, having remodelled on the basis that those 500 doses will not come when we expected them to come. We do expect them to come later, but they won't come when we thought. We still believe that we're able to meet our commitment, which was that we will offer a vaccination appointment to everyone in those JCVI priority groups 1 to 9. So that's everyone over 50 and those people with underlying health conditions, the clinically extremely vulnerable and unpaid carers. And we believe we're still on track to do that and to have vaccinated all adults over 18 in Scotland by the end of July. And we're over 2 million vaccinated now. So we keep looking at it every day. What we have to be sure to do, though, is make sure that not only can we deliver first doses, but that we are delivering the second dose, which is very important, within the 12-week window. So that's the work that's underway. And as of today, we still are confident that we can meet that mid-April commitment, and we'll keep on looking at it every day. I look at it every day, and my officials work on it constantly.
Of course, primary schools in Scotland have been reopened for some time now, the youngest pupils going back on the 22nd of February. You must have some data coming in by now. What does it show when it comes to rising cases?
So there's been a small uptick in cases, but it is small, and we keep an eye on that all the time. The case positivity number, which is also one of, as you know, one of the important bits of information that you look at all the time, remains relatively low, but we just monitor this all the time. And we've said in all the steps that we've set out, the First Minister set out on Tuesday just gone, about how we intend to ease restrictions 2nd of April, 5th of April, end of April. All of that, of course, is dependent on continuing to keep virus numbers low and bring it down, case numbers down, even from where it is just now, on the one hand, and be able to deliver the vaccination programme on the other. So we remain cautiously optimistic that we are still on track. But I think everybody knows, all your viewers will know, and certainly those in Scotland know, that this is a constant exercise, and what we are desperately trying to avoid, so the approach is cautious, is a return to a third lockdown. Nobody wants that. Individually, for people's mental health and well-being, seeing family and friends, but also in economic terms, and absolutely in terms of people's health.
Just finally, on a quite different subject, if I may, a Rangers football player this week, Glenn Kamara, said he was been racially abused by a Slavia Prague player. Now, I'm not going to repeat the words because, frankly, they are far too offensive. But for months, footballers have been taking the knee for Black Lives Matter. If no action is taken in the face of racist abuse, is football just playing lip service?
Well, of course, it is up to the football authorities, the club and the football authorities, both in Scotland and I think internationally. But I would hope it's not enough to be against racism. You've got to actively be anti-racist. In the same way as you have to be actively anti-misogynist, you know? It's not enough to say, I'm not racist. You need to call it out and deal with it. So I would hope that the proper investigation is done there and that the proper action is taken. Because really, in this century, we should be well past insulting and dismissing and diminishing fellow human beings on the basis of their race, their colour, their sex, any disability. These things are just ridiculous in this day and age, and we need to do something about it.
OK, Jeane Freeman, thank you very much for being on the programme. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that is it for this week. A busy show. Do check out the Sophy Ridge on Sunday podcast. We'll record it just after the show, and it should be available from lunchtime. Coming up, don't go anywhere, it is The Take with our political correspondent, Rob Powell, going through the best bits of the interviews for this week. See you next Sunday.